I was 24, fresh out of a liberal arts college in Ohio, and possessed that specific kind of naivety that only young teachers have. I took a job in a town you won't find on most digital maps, nestled deep in the coal country of West Virginia. The locals called the valleys hollers, and the geography was claustrophobic. The sun didn't hit the bottom of the valley until 10 in the morning and was gone behind the ridge by 3 in the afternoon. My students were mostly quiet kids, the sons and daughters of miners and mechanics. They were tough, watchful, and deeply distrustful of outsiders, but none of them unsettled me like Joshua. Joshua was 8 years old, but had the eyes of a man who had seen a war. He lived in Godby Holler, a stretch of land so remote the school bus refused to drive up the gravel switchbacks. His father dropped him off in a rusted pickup truck every morning, and every afternoon the boy waited by the flagpole, staring at the tree line. It started in October, just as the leaves were turning the color of dried blood. I had asked the class to draw their homes. Most kids drew trailers or small wooden houses with smoke curling from chimneys. Joshua drew a forest, but the trees were wrong. I walked over to his desk, crouching down. "Tell me about your picture, Joshua," I said, trying to keep my voice light. He didn't look up. He was pressing the crayon so hard the wax was crumbling. "It's the garden," he whispered. I looked closer. Hanging from the branches of his crude trees weren't apples or leaves. They were shirts, trousers, dresses, and something else. Lumpy brown sacks with jagged black lines for mouths. "Are those scarecrows?" I asked. Joshua stopped coloring. He looked at me, his face pale and serious. "No, sir, those are the make-do men. They watch the house while Daddy sleeps." "Make-do men?" "Like the dolls," he said matter-of-factly. "Made of scraps, made of sacks, but they got insides now." A chill, irrational and sharp, ran down my spine. I dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination, but I kept the drawing. Later that day, in the teacher's lounge, I showed it to Mrs. Gable, the school secretary who had lived in the county for 70 years. She squinted at the paper, and I saw her grip tighten on her coffee mug. The color drained from her face. "Godby Holler. I told the district that boy shouldn't be down here." "What is it?" I asked. "What does he mean by make-do men?" Mrs. Gable looked around to ensure we were alone. "Back in the 1920s, there was a settlement up that holler. Smallpox hit. The county didn't send doctors, they sent deputies to board up the road. Folks say they boarded up the houses too, with the sick still inside, to stop the spread." She tapped a finger on the brown sack figures in the drawing. "The old folks used to say that when the food ran out, the survivors made dolls out of burlap to trick the sickness. But that's just a story. The real story is that nobody goes up to Godby Holler past the pavement end unless they have to. You leave that boy alone, Mr. Thorne." I tried to listen to her, I really did, but 2 weeks later, Joshua stopped coming to school. 3 days passed. No phone call, no note. The principal shrugged it off, saying truancy was common, but the image of those clothing trees kept me awake at night. On the 4th day, driven by a misguided sense of duty, I got into my sedan and drove toward the edge of town. I turned onto the road leading to Godby Holler. The pavement crumbled into gravel, then into dirt packed hard by heavy tires. The trees grew thick here, their branches interlocking overhead to form a tunnel that blocked out the sky. It was unnervingly quiet. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my tires. After 3 miles, the road widened into a clearing. I saw Joshua's house, a dilapidated shack with a sagging porch. But I didn't look at the house. I looked at the woods surrounding it. Joshua hadn't been drawing a fantasy. Dozens of trees ringed the clearing. High up in the branches, swaying gently in the stagnant air, were clothes, flannels, work boots tied by the laces, sundresses gray with mildew, and among them were the sacks, burlap feed bags stuffed with straw or leaves with crude faces painted in tar. They hung like hanged men. I killed the engine. The silence rushed back in, ringing in my ears. I stepped out, the gravel crunching loudly under my dress shoes. "Joshua," I called. My voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the forest. I walked toward the porch, but something caught my eye near the edge of the woods. One of the dolls was propped up against an oak tree, not hanging. It was a crude thing, a potato sack over a torso wrapped in twine. I took a step closer, squinting. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves. Then the doll turned its head. It looked right at me. The painted smile on the burlap didn't move, but the eyes, deep within the coarse fabric holes, glinted with moisture. Human eyes. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. From the periphery of my vision, I saw movement. To my left, to my right. The shapes that I thought were piles of trash or stuffed sacks began to unfold. They rose from the tall grass, stepping out from behind the tree trunks. There were 5 of them. They wore rags and oversized coats, their heads completely covered by burlap sacks tied at the neck. "Hello?" I stammered, backing toward my car. "I'm Joshua's teacher. The figure closest to me, the one leaning against the tree, took a step forward. In its hand, it held something heavy, a rusted pipe wrapped in leather. They didn't speak. They didn't growl. They just moved with a synchronized predatory silence, closing the circle.
Panic is a cold thing. It doesn't heat you up. It freezes your veins. I scrambled backward, fumbling for my car keys, but I had dropped them in the grass when I saw the figure move. I fell to my knees, frantically patting the ground, my eyes darting between the approaching figures. The make-do men were close now. I could smell them. A stench of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and something metallic, like old copper coins. The leader, the one with the pipe, towered over me. The smile painted on his mask was jagged, a permanent, joyful grimace that contrasted with the deadly silence of his posture. "Please," I whispered. He tilted his head. It was a bird-like, twitchy movement. He raised the pipe. Crack. The sound wasn't the pipe hitting me, it was a gunshot. The dirt exploded inches from the leader's boot. He flinched, spinning around with a speed that betrayed his human nature. Standing on the porch of the shack was Joshua. He looked tiny, drowning in a dirty t-shirt, but in his hands he held a double-barreled shotgun that was longer than he was tall. "Daddy!" Joshua screamed, his voice cracking. The burlap figures hesitated. That split second was all I needed. I lunged up, abandoning my keys, and sprinted toward the porch. I heard a guttural shout behind me, not a monster's roar, but a man's angry curse. Heavy boots pounded the earth in pursuit. I vaulted the rotting stairs and crashed through the screen door. Joshua slammed the heavy oak door behind me and threw the deadbolt. "Daddy!" Joshua yelled, running into the dark living room. But there was no daddy. In the corner of the room, slumped in a recliner, was a man who had clearly been dead for days. The smell hit me then, sickness and rot. "He won't wake up," Joshua said, his voice trembling now, the shotgun shaking in his hands. "And they know he's asleep. That's why they came out of the trees." Outside, a heavy thud shook the door, then another. They were throwing themselves against the wood. "Who are they?" I asked, grabbing a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. "The neighbors," Joshua whispered. "From further up the holler, the ones who didn't die in the plague. They like to collect things." The window to my left shattered. A gloved hand reached in, tearing at the curtains. I swung the poker, connecting with bone. A howl of pain erupted from outside, followed by laughter, high-pitched, wheezing laughter. They weren't trying to break in to kill us immediately. They were playing. They were enjoying the terror. We huddled in that living room for what felt like hours. Every few minutes, a rock would hit the roof, or a nail file would scratch slowly down the siding. It was psychological torture. I realized then what the clothes in the trees were. They weren't laundry. They were trophies. trophies of people who had come up here to hike, to explore, or to help. Suddenly, blue lights flashed through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. A siren wailed, cutting through the mountain silence. The scratching stopped instantly. I heard the sound of footsteps retreating into the brush, fast and practiced. "Police!" a voice boomed from a loudspeaker. I collapsed with relief. I grabbed Joshua, covering his eyes so he wouldn't see his father, and we walked out onto the porch. Sheriff Miller stood there with 3 deputies. They didn't have their guns drawn on the woods. They were just standing there, looking tired. "Mr. Thorne," Sheriff Miller tipped his hat. He didn't look surprised to see me. "Sheriff, they're in the woods," I yelled, pointing to the tree line. "Men in masks. They killed Joshua's father. They have trophies in the trees." The sheriff looked at the trees. He looked at the clothes hanging there, evidence of a dozen missing person cases over the last decade. Then he looked at his deputies. "Grab the boy," Miller said to a deputy. "Take him to child services in Charleston tonight." "What about the men?" I demanded as they led a crying Joshua away. "You have to go into the woods." Sheriff Miller walked up the steps and put a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Mr. Thorne, look at this place. Look at these hills. The mines are closed, the jobs are gone, the opioids took half the town, and the poverty took the rest. What does that have to do with murderers in masks? Those aren't just murderers, son. That's the Godby clan, inbred, sick, and mean as snakes. But they keep to their holler, mostly. They tried to kill me. And if I arrest them?" Miller asked, his eyes hard. "A trial, media vans, reporters digging into this town's history, digging into who knew what, digging into why the road was boarded up in the 20s. This town is hanging by a thread, son. A scandal like this, it would snap the fabric of this society. We don't need CNN, we need a solution." "So you're going to let them go?" I was horrified. "No," Miller said. He turned to his remaining deputies. "Boys, go get the tear gas and the charges from the truck. We're going to seal the entrance to the old number 4 mine shaft." "They live in a mine?" I asked. "They hide in it. And tonight, it's going to rain hard. Be a real shame if there was a collapse." He looked at me, his hand resting on his holster. "You were never here, Mr. Thorne. You got lost, had a flat tire, and I gave you a ride home. Joshua is going into the system, far away from here. That's the happy ending. Take it." I took it. I left town the next morning. I didn't pack my apartment, I just drove. I teach in a suburb of Chicago now. It's flat. You can see for miles. But sometimes when the wind blows through the decorative trees in the school parking lot, I hear the rustle of stiff fabric. I checked the news a week after I left. A brief article mentioned a localized landslide in an abandoned mining sector of West Virginia. No casualties reported. But I know better. I know that deep in that holler, behind tons of rock and earth, the make-do men are still there. And in the dark, they don't need masks to hide who they are.
They say there's something in the water in Blackwood County. The scientists will tell you it's iron or sulfur runoff from the old coal mines, which gives it that metallic, biting taste. But the old-timers? They say it's the blood. They say the ground here has drunk so much of it over the last 2 centuries that the earth itself holds a grudge. I'm Deputy Sheriff Elias Thorne, and until last November, I thought those were just stories to scare tourists. Blackwood is the kind of town where everyone waves to everyone. It's a tight-knit community of about 800 souls, tucked into a valley so steep that satellite radio cuts out when you drive Main Street. At the top of the social hierarchy was Silas Vane. Silas was 82, a retired judge, and the closest thing our town had to royalty. He was the kind of man who bought uniforms for the football team and forgave debts when the winter was harsh. That's why the call at 3 a.m. made no sense. 911, what's your emergency? He's bleeding, a neighbor's voice crackled, hysterical. Oh God, they broke him. I was the first on the scene at the Vane estate, a sprawling Victorian house on the edge of town. The front door wasn't kicked in, it was unlocked. I drew my service weapon and moved into the hallway. The house smelled of lavender and something copper, fresh blood. I found Silas in his study. It wasn't a robbery. The silver on the mantel was untouched. The cash in his wallet sitting on the desk was all there. But Silas, he had been systematically dismantled. He was tied to his heavy oak chair, his face a ruin of bruises. He was unconscious but alive, his breathing a wet, ragged rattle. But the most chilling part wasn't the violence, it was the mess. The room was destroyed, but not randomly. The bookshelves had been stripped. Hundreds of books were torn apart, their pages carpeting the floor in a sea of paper. But not just any books. They were history books, local records, genealogies. And stuffed into Silas's mouth, gagging him, was a wad of crumpled paper. I pulled it out carefully, bagging it as evidence while the paramedics rushed in to stabilize him. It was a page torn from a very old leather-bound ledger. The ink was faded, brown with age, dated October 14th, 1894. It was a list of names, and across the names, someone had scrawled in fresh red Sharpie, "Paid in full." The investigation hit a wall immediately. No fingerprints, no DNA that didn't belong to Silas. No forced entry meant Silas likely knew who opened the door, or they had a key. For 3 days, the town was in a state of shock. Who would hurt the judge? He was the descendant of Governor Vane, the man who put this town on the map 100 years ago. I sat in the station, staring at the evidence board. The sheriff, a tired man named Miller, who was 2 years from retirement, told me to focus on drifters. Probably some meth head looking for pills, Miller said, refusing to look at the photos at the crime scene. Meth heads don't leave 100-year-old documents in the victim's mouth, Sheriff, I argued, and they don't ignore $200 in cash sitting right next to them. I couldn't let it go. I took the copy of the ledger page to the county archives in the basement of the library. The air down there was cool and smelled of dust. The archivist, a young woman named Sarah, looked at the scan of the page. "This looks like a court document," she said, adjusting her glasses, "from the aftermath of the Kincaid-Vane feud." I nodded. Everyone knew the stories. The Vanes and the Kincaids were our version of the Hatfields and the Coys. They killed each other over property lines and pig theft for 20 years. The Vanes won. The Kincaids, well, they mostly died out or moved away. "Look at the date," Sarah pointed out. October 14th, 1894. That was the night of the gavel, the night Governor Vane, Silas's grandfather, refused to extradite 3 Vane men who had burned down the Kincaid homestead. He protected his own. The Kincaids lost everything that night. Their land was seized to pay for the damages to the town. "So someone's angry about a court case from 120 years ago?" I asked skeptically. "People take heritage seriously here, Elias," Sarah said. She turned to her computer. "Actually, it's funny you mention this. We've had a lot of traffic in the archives lately. Not tourists, locals." "Who?" "Genealogy stuff," she shrugged. "People digging into their family trees. Sites like Ancestry.com have made it trendy. A lot of people in town are realizing their last names aren't their real names. You know how it was back then. People changed their names to escape debt or the law." A cold feeling started in my stomach. "Sarah, can you pull up a list of who's been accessing the Kincaid records specifically?" She typed for a moment, then frowned. "That's weird." "What?" "It's not one person. It's a lot of them. The records have been checked out or viewed digitally by 12 different accounts in the last month." She printed the list of names, current residents of Blackwood who had suddenly taken a deep interest in the Kincaid bloodline. I read the list. My breath caught in my throat. The mechanic who fixed my cruiser, the woman who ran the daycare, the quiet man who bagged groceries at the IGA, the high school history teacher. I knew these people. I had barbecued with them. They weren't criminals. They were the fabric of the town. But as I ran their names through the genealogy database Sarah had open, the pattern emerged like a skull beneath the skin. The mechanic's great-grandmother was a Kincaid. The teacher's great-grandfather was a Kincaid bastard. The grocer was a direct descendant of the man who lost the farm in 1894. They were all Kincaids, and they had all found out recently. I left the library with my hand resting on my gun. The town looked different now. The friendly waves from people on the sidewalk didn't look friendly anymore. They looked practiced. I drove to the auto shop first. I needed to talk to Jim, the mechanic. He was a big guy, soft-spoken. He had fixed my radiator for free last winter. When I pulled up, the bay doors were open. Jim was wiping grease off a wrench with a red rag. He watched me get out of the car, his expression unreadable. "Afternoon, deputy," Jim said. He didn't smile. "Jim," I nodded, "I have some questions about where you were Tuesday night." "Home," he said simply, "watching TV." "Can anyone verify that?" "My wife." I stepped closer. "Jim, I was just at the library. Sarah tells me you've been doing some research into your family tree." Jim stopped wiping the wrench. He looked me in the eye, and for the first time I noticed how dark his eyes were. "Man wants to know where he comes from, Elias. Is that a crime?" "It is if he decides to settle a debt from a century ago," I said, my voice dropping. "Silas Vane is dying in the hospital." "Silas Vane is a rich old man living on stolen land. His grandfather signed a paper that starved my family. That history doesn't just go away because you forgot about it." "That was 1894, Jim. Silas didn't do it." Jim took a step forward, towering over me. "The debt remains. It's in the blood. You think we didn't know? We always knew. We just found each other. We realized we weren't alone." "Who is we?" I demanded. Jim just smiled. It was a cold, thin smile. "Look around, deputy. We're the people who fix your cars, teach your kids, and handle your food. We're the people who have been eating dirt for 100 years while the Vanes sat on the hill." He leaned in close, whispering, "You can't arrest a town, Elias." He was right, and that was the horror of it. I backed away, getting into my cruiser. As I reversed out of the lot, I saw Jim pull out his phone. He was making a call. My radio crackled. It was Sheriff Miller. "Thorne, get back to the station, now." His voice was tight. I sped back to the precinct. When I burst into the sheriff's office, he was shredding papers. "Sheriff, we have a conspiracy," I started, breathless. "It's the Kincaid descendants. Jim, the teacher, maybe a dozen others. They targeted Silas because of the feud. We need to bring them in." Miller stopped the shredder. He looked at me with sad, tired eyes. "And charged them with what, Elias?" "Assault, attempted murder." "Where's the proof? Did Jim confess? Did you find a bloody glove? Or did you just find out that his great-granddaddy was pissed off?" "They organized it. They used public records to find the victim and each other." "Elias," Miller said, walking around the desk, "Silas Vane died 10 minutes ago in the hospital. Heart failure." "Then it's a murder investigation." "It's a tragedy," Miller corrected me firmly. "A break-in gone wrong by unknown transients. That's the official report." I stared at him. You know who they are." Miller sighed, looking out the window at the town square where the leaves were turning brown. "My mother was a Kincaid, Elias. She changed her name to Miller in the 50s so she could get a loan from the bank." The room spun slightly. I took a step back, my hand hovering near my holster. "I didn't touch Silas," Miller said softly, "but I didn't stop it either. Some accounts have to be balanced. It's just nature. It's the ecosystem of this valley." He turned back to me. "The Vane line ended with Silas. He had no kids. The estate will likely be sold off, probably to the county, probably for cheap. The land returns to the people. Justice is done."
"That's not justice," I whispered. "That's a lynch mob." "It's history," Miller said. "Now, you have two choices, Deputy. You can keep digging, make a lot of noise, and realize that you live alone in a house surrounded by woods 10 miles from the nearest backup. Or you can sign this report, go home, and drink the water like the rest of us." I looked at the report on the desk. Perpetrator? Unknown. I thought about Jim holding that wrench. I thought about the teacher who watched my niece during the day. I thought about the sweet old lady who ran the bakery and gave me free donuts, whose name was on that list I found in the library. I signed the paper. I still live in Blackwood. I'm the sheriff now. Miller retired a month later and moved to Florida. The town is quiet. The crime rate is virtually zero. People are polite. They smile. But sometimes, when I'm driving patrol at night, I see bonfires up on the ridges where the old Kincaid land used to be. I see shadows standing around the fire, holding hands. And every time I take a drink of water from the tap, I taste it. I taste the iron. I taste the rust. And I know, deep down, it's not mineral runoff. It's the taste of a debt paid in full. And I wonder, every single day, if my ancestors owe anyone anything, and if the cashier at the grocery store is just waiting for the right moment to collect.
My grandmother used to tell me that in Appalachia there are two kinds of roads, the ones the state maintains and the ones the mountains tolerate. She told me never to take the latter after sundown. I should have listened. I was driving from Asheville to Knoxville, taking a scenic shortcut suggested by my GPS to avoid a pileup on I-40. It was late November. The trees were bare skeletons against a slate-gray sky, and the temperature was dropping fast. By the time the sun dipped below the ridges, I realized my phone had lost signal an hour ago. The road was narrow, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through dense, claustrophobic forestry. I hadn't seen another car in 40 minutes. Then the low fuel light pinged, a bright, angry orange eye on my dashboard. Panic started to prickle at the back of my neck. I was miles from civilization, surrounded by nothing but deep hollers and silence. Just as I was calculating how cold I would get sleeping in the car, I saw a flicker of neon through the trees. It was a gas station, if you could call it that. It sat on a leveled-out patch of gravel at the very crest of a hill. A single pump, a small shack with a sundries sign, and a flickering overhead light that buzzed like a dying insect. I pulled in. The gravel popped loudly under my tires, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. I got out, the cold mountain air biting my cheeks. It was dead silent. No crickets, no wind, just the hum of that light and the ticking of my car's cooling engine. I swiped my card at the pump. It was an old analog machine, the kind with spinning numbers. It clunked into life, and as I stood there, shivering, gripping the nozzle, I got the overwhelming sensation of being watched. I looked toward the shack. The windows were dark, covered in grime. I looked toward the road I had come from, empty. Then I looked at the woods directly behind the station. Something was moving in the brush. It wasn't an animal. The cadence was wrong, too heavy, too clumsy. A man stepped out of the tree line. He didn't walk, he shambled. He was impossibly thin, his clothes hanging off him like wet laundry on a wire frame. He wore a heavy wool coat that looked decades old, stained with oil and mud, and oversized work boots that dragged in the gravel. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling. "I'm just getting gas. I'll be gone in a second." He didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He just kept coming, moving into the circle of light cast by the flickering bulb. That's when I saw his face. It was slack, the skin gray and pulled tight over his cheekbones. His mouth hung slightly open, revealing blackened gums, but it was his eyes that froze my blood. They were empty. I don't mean he looked vacant or drugged. I mean they looked like two pits of crude oil. There was no white, no iris, just a flat, dead, matte blackness that seemed to absorb the light. He stopped about 10 feet away from me. The smell hit me then, a wave of rotting leaves, wet dog, and something sharp like gunpowder.
Can I help you?" I asked, backing up against my car door. I reached behind me, fumbling for the nozzle to put it back, gasoline dripping onto my boots. The man raised his right arm. His hand was shaking violently, a tremor that rattled his whole frame. In his grip was a revolver. It was massive, an archaic piece of iron that looked like it had been buried in the mud for 50 years. The metal was pitted with rust, the handle wrapped in electrical tape. He leveled it at my chest. "You," he croaked. His voice sounded like grinding stones. It wasn't a demand, it was just a statement of recognition, as if he knew me, or as if he was surprised to see anything living. "Whoa, okay, I'll put my hands up," my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Take the car, take my wallet, it's on the seat." The man didn't look at the car. He took a step closer. The tremor in his hand got worse. He looked like he was fighting his own muscles, or like a puppet on strings manipulated by a drunk. He cocked the hammer. The sound was a loud, dry clack that echoed across the valley. I stared down the barrel of that rusted gun. I saw the cylinder turn. I saw the lead tip of a bullet. "Please," I whispered. The man's lips peeled back in a rictus grin, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. He wasn't robbing me. He wasn't looking for a ride. He was looking for something to break. His finger tightened on the trigger. I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't want to see the flash. I waited for the pain, the heat, the end. Boom! The sound was deafening, a concussive blast that slapped the air out of my lungs. I screamed, crumpling to the gravel, covering my head, waiting for the blood. But the pain never came. I gasped for air, opening my eyes, checking my chest. I was whole. I looked up. The man was on the ground, writhing silently. He wasn't screaming, which was almost worse than if he had been. He was just opening and closing that black, toothy mouth in a silent mimicry of agony. His right hand was gone. The gun hadn't fired the bullet out of the barrel. The rusted, fatigued metal of the cylinder had failed. The weapon had exploded in his hand, sending shrapnel backward and sideways. The barrel lay smoking in the gravel a few feet away. I stood up, shaking, bile rising in my throat. I stared at the man. Even with his hand mangled, bleeding black, sludge-like blood into the white stones, his eyes remained fixed on me, hateful, empty. The door to the shack slammed open. "Get back!" a voice roared. I spun around. An old man in a grease-stained jumpsuit stormed out. He looked like a standard gas station attendant, baseball cap, stubble, weary eyes, except he was holding a pump-action shotgun. He didn't point it at the bleeding stranger. He pointed it at the ground, but he kept his eyes on the woods. "Did he touch you?" the attendant barked at me. "No, the gun exploded," I stammered, pointing at the writhing figure. The attendant walked over to the stranger. He didn't offer first aid. He didn't call 911. He looked down at the mangled figure with a look of pure exhaustion, like one looks at a recurring plumbing problem. "Third time this month," the attendant muttered. He nudged the stranger's boot with his own. "Get back in the dark, Silas. You ain't getting a soul tonight. The iron didn't hold." The stranger stopped writhing. He looked up at the attendant. The hate in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a confused, animalistic fear. Slowly, clutching his ruined arm to his chest, the stranger scrambled backward. He crab-walked on his heels and one good hand, retreating back toward the tree line. "Wait!" I yelled. "He needs a hospital!" The attendant spun on me. "You get in your car, missy. You get in your car right now." "But there ain't no hospital for what he is," the old man snapped. "And you don't want to be here when his kin come to see what the noise was." He racked the slide of his shotgun. "Chuck, chuck." "Drive," he commanded. "Do not look in your rearview mirror until you hit the pavement of Route 19. Do not stop. Do not come back to pay." "Why?" I asked, tears finally spilling over. "What was that?" The attendant looked at the blood on the gravel, that dark, thick ooze that didn't look like human blood. "Sometimes folks get lost in these hills. And sometimes they get so hungry and so cold that they forget how to die. But the things they carry, the clothes, the guns, they rot. You got saved by rust, girl. The only thing in these mountains that tells the truth is decay. He looked me dead in the eye. Go, before the rust holds. I didn't argue. I jumped into my car, tearing the nozzle out of the tank and throwing it on the ground. I slammed the door and floored it. I drove like a maniac. I took corners on 2 wheels, my high beams cutting through the suffocating darkness. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't look at the woods. But I heard them. Over the roar of my engine, I heard sounds coming from the trees flanking the road. Whoops, hollers, the sound of heavy branches snapping as things kept pace with my car. I didn't slow down until I saw the streetlights of a small town 20 miles away. I pulled into a brightly lit 24-hour diner parking lot and just sat there, shaking, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I never told the police. What would I say? That a zombie tried to shoot me with a Civil War relic? I looked up the location on Google Maps a week later. I wanted to see if it was real. I found the road. I found the hill. But on the satellite view, there was no gas station. Just a clearing in the trees, overgrown with kudzu, and the ruins of a stone foundation that looked like it had burned down 50 years ago. But I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere in my trunk, tucked into the carpet lining, is a jagged piece of rusted metal that flew through my open window when the gun exploded. I keep it, not as a souvenir, but as a reminder that sometimes the only thing standing between you and the abyss is a little bit of bad maintenance.